Welcome to episode 170 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It is April 19, 1960. Montevideo, Estadio Centenario. Peñarol against Jorge Wilstermann. A Chilean referee, a Bolivian champion, a Uruguayan giant, roughly 35,000 in the ground, and a competition with a grand name but no history yet, Copa de Campeones de América. By the end of the night, it has history. The first kick, the first goal, the first great star turn, the first giant scoreline. Peñarol wins 7-1. Carlos Borges scores the first goal in the history of the tournament. Alberto Spencer scores 4, which means the first hat-trick, and in truth, much more than that. And South America's club game, after decades of imagining itself beyond borders, finally has its own proper continental cup. This is where the Copa Libertadores begins. But how did we get here? We have to go back to the tournament we talked about in episode 134. Santiago, 1948. That South American Championship of Champions, won by Vasco da Gama, had already proved the central idea. South America could stage a continental club competition. The clubs would come, the crowds would care, and the football would justify the effort. But 1948 had also shown the limits of the first model. One city, one stadium, one long round robin, a month-long football congress, beautiful, ambitious, but awkward to repeat every year across a vast continent. So the idea survived, but it needed a better shape. And in the 1950s, the wider football world was changing in ways that made the idea harder to ignore. Europe had launched the European Cup in 1955. Real Madrid made it feel glamorous immediately. South American football, meanwhile, remained magnificently strong, but the decade also saw more movement of talent and prestige across borders. Alfredo Di Stefano left River's world, passed through Bogota, then changed Real Madrid forever. South America did not need Europe's permission to know its own quality, but it did need a definite club championship of its own. That is where the administrators come in. At CONMEBOL level, José Ramos de Freitas was central to getting the competition moving. In Chile, the memory of the 1948 experiment remained powerful. And in Uruguay, Peñarol's own leadership understood early what this could mean. Later recollections from the club stressed how figures such as Gaston Huelfi and Washington Cataldi grasped the importance of a real continental championship before many others did. There was also a transatlantic nudge. One later retelling of the tournament's creation says that UEFA General Secretary Henri Delaunay had proposed a contest between the champions of Europe and South America, an idea that helped strengthen the case for South American Champions Cup first. By March 1959, at a congress in Buenos Aires, the new competition was approved for 1960, and it came back in smarter form than 1948. Not a single city league table, but home and away eliminations, champions facing champions, knockout tension instead of festival sprawl. Even then, the whole continent did not quite buy in yet. Only 7 clubs entered. Peru's champion withdrew before the draw. Venezuela's federation was not interested. Ecuador had no national champion to send. So the first edition would begin with just 7 sides: Peñarol, Jorge Wilstermann, San Lorenzo, Bahia, Universidad de Chile, and Millonarios, and Olimpia. That smaller field is important, because Libertadores did not begin with Universal Thunder. It began as an idea, still proving itself. And that is why the first match matters so much. The 2 clubs who met were not in random. Peñarol were the Uruguayan champions, though even that had come dramatically late. Their 1959 title was only decided on March 20, 1960, when they beat Nacional 2-0 in the delayed championship decider. So Peñarol arrived as the last qualifier to the new tournament, but also as one of the great clubs of the Rio de la Plata world, already institutionally large enough to sense what this cup could become. Jorge Wilstermann came from a very different football biography. They were a much younger club, born in Cochabamba in 1949, out of workers from the Lloyd Aero Boliviano, and later named in honor of the pioneering aviator Jorge Wilstermann. They were champions of Bolivia, and they carried something the first Libertadores badly needed: geographic breadth. This was not just Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Rio talking to themselves. Bolivia was in the room from the very first kick. And in Montevideo, that first kick was treated as a serious occasion. The build-up was conspicuous. The arrival of Wilstermann was heavily publicized. The president of the Bolivian Federation, Valera Camara, was in Montevideo well before the match, preparing the visit and using the moment diplomatically too. Pablo Perez Estrada, the Wilstermann president, arrived on April 13. In other words, this was not being staged as a curiosity, it was being staged as a beginning. And then the game began. Osberto Garcia of Wilstermann took the tournament's first touch. The first referee was Juan Carlos Robles of Chile, and the first stadium was the Centenario. The first great eruption came in the 13th minute. Luis Cubilla crashed a shot against the bar, Borges pounced on the rebound, and there it was, the first goal in the history of the Copa. Peñarol were 1-0 up. 4 minutes later, Borges got another. By the 20th minute, Cubilla himself had made it 3-0. In the 29th minute, Bilia Martinez missed a penalty. Half an hour in, the first Libertadores match was already starting to look less like a ceremonial opener and more like a declaration. And then Alberto Spencer entered the scoreline. In the 35th minute, he made it 4-0. Wilstermann did pull one back through Maximo Alcocer early in the second half at 4-1, and for a moment the score breathed again. But then Spencer took it away. He scored again in the 57th minute, in the 66th, and again in the 89th minute. Final score, Peñarol 7, Jorge Wilstermann 1. Think about what that meant for a first night. Not a cautious 0-0, not a nervous administrative formality. A 7-goal statement by the club that would become the first champion, and a 4-goal masterpiece by the man who would become the competition's greatest scorer. It is almost too neat. History rarely introduces itself this cleanly. Yet here it did. So what did this first night mean? It gave the new competition immediate authority. A first match can be forgettable. This one wasn't. Peñarol made sure of that. The opening scoreline was so emphatic that it helped turn the tournament from an administrative creation into a football event. Then Peñarol kept going. They eliminated Wilstermann, survived a tough semi-final against San Lorenzo that required a playoff, and then beat Olimpia in the final to become the first champions of South America. We'll talk about that first trophy in a later episode. Also, it introduced one of Libertadores' defining figures immediately and at full volume. Alberto Spencer had arrived in Montevideo only weeks earlier that year. By June, he was the top scorer of the first edition with 7 goals. In time, he would become the tournament's all-leading scorer with 54. So the first great individual performance in Libertadores history was not a footnote. It was the beginning of the competition's greatest scoring legend. And then the cup itself. It kept growing. In 1965, it adopted the name Copa Libertadores de América, tying the tournament explicitly to the liberators of the continent. Then came dynasties. Peñarol first, Santos, Independiente, Estudiantes, Nacional, Boca, River, Flamengo. The Intercontinental Cup gave its winners a road to Europe's champions, and around the main competition grew a whole ecosystem of South American club football, later the Supercopa, Mercosur, Merconorte, and in today's structure above all the Sudamericana and the Recopa. But there was another inheritance too. Libertadores became not only glamorous, but combustible. The rest of the world learned to see it as brilliant and hostile, mythic and intimidating, technically wonderful, and sometimes violently excessive. That reputation didn't come from nowhere, and it still shadows the competition now. As for the two clubs in this first match, both remained part of the story. Peñarol became one of Libertadores' foundational powers. They won the first one, then more besides, and today still sit among the competition's great institutions. Wilstermann did not vanish into this 7-1 defeat. They became one of Bolivia's major clubs, and in 1981, first Bolivian side to reach the Libertadores semi-final. So the beaten team in the first game also turned out to be real, which matters, because a proper first chapter needs more than one serious club in it. And maybe that is the best way to understand April 19, 1960, not just as the day Libertadores started, but as the night the tournament found the tone it would keep for decades: travel, prestige, champions, pressure, noise, mythology, and that constant sense that the continent was arguing for football supremacy in its own language. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 19, 1960. First, Libertadores did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of the 1948 South American Championship of Champions, but returned in 1960 in a more practical and repeatable format. Second, the first match could hardly have been more dramatic. Peñarol 7, Jorge Wilstermann 1, gave the tournament its first goal, its first star performance, and its first unmistakable statement. Third, this was the beginning not only of a competition, but of an ecosystem and a mythology, one that would produce dynasties, intercontinental showdowns, unforgettable atmospheres, and a permanent place at the center of World Club football. On this day in 1960, Peñarol beat Jorge Wilstermann 7-1 in Montevideo in the first match ever played in the Copa de Campeones de América, giving South American club football its first true continental night, the Copa Libertadores, its first great memory. That's all for episode 170 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. Tomorrow, we go back 8 years to a forgotten tournament called the Pan American Championship and to April 20, 1952, when Brazil became its first winner. See you then.